Behind the rubber-faced comedy and the record-breaking paychecks is a story most fans have never fully pieced together. It involves a check written on a hilltop by a man with nothing, a documentary so unsettling that one of his own co-stars called it deranged, and a courtroom battle that nearly ended in a very different kind of headline than the ones his films usually generated. Some of it he has told himself, on camera, in his own words. Over decades of interviews, most viewers never connected into a single narrative. Here is what actually happened. Number 10. The $10 million check. In the mid-1980s, Jim Carrey was a struggling stand-up comedian with no steady income, driving a beaten-up Toyota through the Hollywood Hills most nights just to have somewhere quiet to sit and think through what his career had so far failed to become. He has said in multiple interviews, including appearances on Oprah and with Barbara Walters, that he would park along Mulholland Drive, look out over the lights of a city that had not noticed him yet, and talk himself into believing his career was already real. Sometime around 1985, Carrey took that ritual one step further, turning a private nightly habit into something far more concrete and lasting. He pulled out his checkbook and wrote himself a check for $10 million, made out to Jim Carrey, with the memo line reading for acting services rendered. He post-dated it roughly a decade into the future, to Thanksgiving of 1995, and carried the check in his wallet from that point forward, watching it slowly wear down at the folds over the years that followed. Carrey has since described the exercise not as blind faith, but as a coping mechanism, saying in a 2014 appearance on The Graham Norton Show that at the time, it was really just a way of making himself feel better after another night of driving home with nothing to show for his efforts. A physical reminder that the things he wanted were, in his words, out there somewhere, even if he did not yet have his hands on them. What happened next is the part that turns the story from a quirky habit into something stranger. In 1994, Carrey's career detonated all at once, with Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, and The Mask both becoming massive hits within months of each other. Later that same year, he signed on to star in Dumb and Dumber for a payday of exactly $10 million, finalized just months before his self-imposed deadline arrived. Carrey's father, Percy, a former saxophonist who had spent years working as an accountant to support the family, died in 1994, not long after his son's fortunes had finally turned. Carrey later revealed that he placed the worn, barely legible check into his father's casket, a private way of letting the man who had once driven him to comedy clubs take proof of the dream with him, telling one interviewer that he considered the check to have been their dream together rather than his alone. That same father, and the moment his own career collapsed decades earlier, turns out to be the real starting point of this entire story. One that began not with success, but with a level of poverty most fans have no idea Carrey ever lived through, tucked away behind decades of headlines about record salaries and box office records. Number 9. A family living out of a van. Jim Carrey was born in January 1962 in Newmarket, Ontario, the youngest of 4 children in what he has described as a comfortable, lower-middle-class household, with a father who worked steadily and a mother who managed the home. His father, Percy, worked as an accountant while playing saxophone on the side, a musical career he had largely set aside decades earlier in order to provide a more stable income for his family. For years, the family lived a relatively stable life by that arrangement. That stability disappeared when Carrey was around 12 years old and his father lost his accounting job, a single event Carrey has since pointed to as the moment his entire childhood changed direction. The family's financial collapse was severe. According to Carrey's own account in interviews with James Lipton on Inside the Actor's Studio and later with The Hollywood Reporter, the Carreys went from lower middle class to what he called complete poverty almost overnight, with no cushion of savings to soften the fall. For a period of roughly 8 months, the family lived out of a yellow Volkswagen camper van, parking at campgrounds including Charles Daly Park on the shore of Lake Ontario. Carrey has joked that, having grown up in Canada, he initially assumed the family had simply gone on an extended camping trip, since his parents tried to shield him and his siblings from the full scope of what was happening, largely out of embarrassment over how far their circumstances had fallen. Once Percy Carrey found work as a security guard at a tire factory in Scarborough called Titan Wheels, the rest of the family went to work there as well, turning what had once been a private household crisis into something closer to a shared family survival project that involved every member of the household pitching in. Jim and his older brother John took jobs as janitors and security guards at the same plant, working 8-hour shifts after school just to help keep the family afloat. Carrey has said the janitorial work came with its own indignities, describing factory employees who played malicious pranks on him specifically because he was the boss's teenage son, further stoking the resentment he already felt about his circumstances. He has said the experience left him consistently angry, describing a version of himself as a teenager who wanted, in his own words, to bash somebody's head in. He dropped out of high school at 16 on his own birthday to work full-time and help support the household. Around the same time, he began falling in with a rougher crowd at the factory, a shift he later attributed directly to the pressure of feeling like he had to grow up and take responsibility for the family's survival long before he was emotionally ready for it. Adding to the strain at home, Carrey has said his mother, Kathleen, struggled with chronic pain and an addiction to pain medication throughout this period, describing her as loving but frequently unwell in ways that were difficult for a child to fully understand or explain to anyone outside the family. In a 2004 interview, when asked directly where his sense of humor came from, Carrey answered in a single word: depression, before elaborating that he had a sick mother and wanted to make her feel better. Performing comedy for her in their living room, doing impressions and contorting his face until she laughed, became his way of coping with a household that otherwise felt heavy with worry, a habit he has described as the true origin point of his career rather than any stage or spotlight that came later. That instinct to perform for an audience of one eventually pushed Carrey toward a real stage, and his first attempt at it went about as badly as a debut possibly could. Number 8. Booed off stage at 15. Long before Hollywood, Carrey's first real shot at comedy came at Yuck Yucks, a well-known comedy club in Toronto that served as a launching pad for numerous Canadian comedians over the following decades and remains one of the country's most storied venues for stand-up. His father, eager to support his son's ambitions despite the family's financial struggles, drove him into the city to perform at an amateur night, a gesture Carrey has since described as one of the clearest examples of his father's belief in him during a period when almost nothing else in their lives was going well. Carrey has since described the performance bluntly, telling People magazine in 2017 that he stood up on stage and delivered what he called a horrible, corny act built around impressions he had practiced obsessively at home. The crowd did not respond kindly. By his own account, he was essentially booed off the stage, a humiliating first exposure to the exact kind of audience rejection that would define years of his early career. Rather than treating the experience as a sign to quit, Carrey kept returning to the same stages, refining his act through the late 1970s while continuing to juggle school and, later, his factory job. By 1979, still a teenager, he was making a living, however modest, from stand-up alone, eventually working his way up to opening for established comedians, including Rodney Dangerfield and Buddy Hackett, two of the biggest names on the club circuit at the time. That same willingness to fail badly in front of a crowd and keep going anyway later defined his approach to film work, most famously in a scene from his first true starring vehicle that nearly didn't make it past a single take. Number 7. The scene that wasn't in the script. By the early 1990s, Carrey had built a following through the sketch series In Living Color, where his rubber-faced physical comedy, including a recurring character known as Fire Marshal Bill, first reached a national audience and established the exaggerated, elastic performance style that would define nearly everything he did on screen afterward. His transition to film leading roles arrived with 1994's Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, a low-budget comedy that outperformed nearly every expectation placed on it, eventually earning more than $100 million at the box office against a fraction of that in production costs. One of the film's most quoted moments came from a scene that was never written into the script at all. Early in the movie, Ace Ventura greets a colleague at the police department by pretending to speak through his own backside, using an exaggerated, distorted voice paired with a string of puns. Actor Tone Loc, who played the colleague on the receiving end of the bit, later explained in an interview that the moment was entirely improvised by Carrey on the spot, with nothing resembling it appearing in the original pages of the script. When the filmmakers asked Carrey to repeat the performance for additional camera coverage, he told them he physically could not recreate it since the entire bit had come out of a single, unrepeatable burst of inspiration rather than anything rehearsed. Tone Loc said keeping a straight face through the scene required real effort on his part, and that the freedom Carrey was given to improvise whatever came to him was, in his view, part of what made the film work, as well as it did with audiences who had never seen anything quite like it before. Ace Ventura's success set off a run of hits that made Carrey one of the most bankable comedic actors alive, a reputation that would soon be tested by a single contract so large it briefly became bigger news than any film he had made. Number 6. The $20 Million Gamble. By late 1995, after Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber had all become massive successes within roughly 18 months of each other, every studio in Hollywood wanted Carrey's next film, and his asking price had become the subject of constant industry speculation. Sony made an offer that had never been extended to any actor before. $20 million up front for a single movie, nearly double what established stars like Harrison Ford or Mel Gibson were commanding at the time for comparable leading roles. The film was The Cable Guy, a dark comedy about an unhinged, emotionally needy cable installer who latches onto a new customer and slowly begins dismantling his life piece by piece. The sum immediately became a story of its own, appearing in magazine headlines and entertainment coverage that focused as much on Carrey's paycheck as on the film itself, with one entertainment magazine putting a grinning photo of Carrey on its cover, alongside the headline joking that readers would be smiling too if they had just been paid $20 million for a single project. The payday also reportedly triggered a broader shift across the industry, with other major stars, including John Travolta, said to have pushed their own asking prices upward in response, eager not to be left behind by Carrey's new number. When The Cable Guy opened in June 1996, it debuted at number 1, but its box office run ultimately underwhelmed against a $47 million budget, earning just over $60 million domestically and roughly $103 million worldwide by the end of its run, figures considered disappointing given the size of Carrey's fee alone. Critics at the time largely blamed Carrey's new salary for skewing expectations of what the film needed to earn back. Reviewers also seemed unprepared for how genuinely dark the film was, expecting another broad comedy in the mold of Ace Ventura, and instead getting an unsettling character study about loneliness and celebrity obsession, directed by Ben Stiller and featuring a supporting cast that included Matthew Broderick, Leslie Mann, Jack Black, and Owen Wilson. The film was widely labeled the first real misstep of Carrey's career, even though it technically turned a profit worldwide. Carrey rebounded almost immediately the following year with Liar Liar, which returned him to the broad, high-concept comedy audiences had originally embraced him for and quickly outperformed The Cable Guy at the box office. Decades later, The Cable Guy has been reevaluated by critics and audiences as a prescient, underappreciated work rather than the flop it was once considered, with Carrey himself later naming it among his favorite projects and praising the ensemble cast Stiller had assembled around him. That willingness to push into genuinely dark territory, rather than staying safely inside broad comedy, became the defining thread of Carrey's next major project, one that required him to disappear into another performer so completely that even the crew stopped calling him by his own name. Number 5. 2 years inside someone else's skin. In 1999, Carrey took on the role of Andy Kaufman, the famously unpredictable comedian and performance artist best known for his work on Taxi and his uncategorizable live performances in the biopic Man on the Moon, directed by Milos Forman. To prepare, Carrey committed to a method acting process that extended far beyond ordinary research, choosing to remain in character as Kaufman, and at times as Kaufman's abrasive lounge singer alter ego Tony Clifton for the entirety of the 85-day production. Cast and crew members, including Danny DeVito, Courtney Love, and Paul Giamatti, along with members of Kaufman's own family who visited the set, were instructed to address Carrey only as Andy or Tony, depending on which persona he was inhabiting that day. The production itself was shot largely in the same sequence as Kaufman's actual life had unfolded, an unusual choice meant to let the cast experience his story in order, which only deepened how thoroughly Carrey stayed embedded inside the role from the first day of filming to the last. Behind-the-scenes footage, later compiled into the 2017 Netflix documentary Jim and Andy, showed a range of behavior during the shoot, from relatively harmless antics like blasting music too loud, to genuinely hostile moments involving thrown cups of water, spitting incidents, and verbal confrontations with cast and crew who were simply trying to do their jobs. Universal Pictures reportedly kept much of this footage locked away for nearly 2 decades, concerned it would damage Carrey's public image if it were ever released. Director Milos Forman reportedly pleaded early on for Carrey to break character, before eventually giving up and addressing him as Andy, just to keep production moving. A concession that effectively meant the film's own director spent months deferring to an actor who refused to answer to his real name. One of the most extreme moments involved professional wrestler Jerry Lawler, who had genuinely feuded with Kaufman in a worked wrestling storyline years earlier, and who became so provoked by Carrey's in-character taunting between takes on set that a real physical altercation broke out between them, ending with Carrey being carried away on an actual stretcher, despite the incident having started as a staged bit for the cameras. Reflecting on the experience nearly 2 decades later for the documentary, Carrey said he did not feel like he had made the film at all, describing the sensation as though Kaufman himself had shown up, tapped him on the shoulder, and taken over completely for the length of the shoot, adding that whatever happened after that point was entirely out of his control. Not everyone in the industry viewed the approach favorably. Actor Martin Freeman later criticized the behavior captured in Jim and Andy as self-indulgent, calling it, in his words, some of the most self-aggrandizing and narcissistic behavior he had ever seen an actor justify in the name of craft, and questioning why any part of the culture would celebrate an actor claiming to have lost his own identity to a role rather than remaining grounded enough to hear a director call cut and simply return to being himself between setups. That same immersive, all-consuming instinct followed Carrey into a very different kind of film the year before, one that he has said permanently altered how he thought about fame, identity, and the difference between the two. Number 4, the film that changed how he saw himself. In 1998, a year before Man on the Moon, Carrey starred in The Truman Show, playing a man who slowly discovers that his entire life has been broadcast as a television program without his knowledge, with everyone around him, including his wife and closest friend, secretly performing scripted roles for a hidden audience of millions watching from around the world. The film earned Carrey a Golden Globe and is now widely regarded as one of the most prescient films of its era, anticipating reality television and the surveillance culture of the following decades, years before either had fully taken hold of popular media. Carrey has said in later interviews that making the film left a lasting impression on him that went beyond a typical role, describing it as a project that forced him to confront questions about performance, authenticity, and the constructed nature of celebrity that he continued turning over in his mind for years afterward, long after the film itself had left theaters. In the Jim and Andy documentary, filmed nearly 2 decades later, Carrey directly connected the two films, referring to the fictional town of Seaside from The Truman Show as a metaphor for the artificial nature of his own public identity, stating plainly that the persona known as Jim Carrey was, in his words, a character that had been playing him his entire life. That idea, of Carrey as a performance layered on top of a private and largely unseen person, would resurface again and again in the years that followed, long after the cameras on his biggest comedies had stopped rolling, eventually becoming the defining lens through which he discussed his entire career. Long before Carrey began questioning the nature of fame in philosophical terms, a relationship with another public figure pulled him into a very different and far more damaging kind of public controversy. Number 3, the vaccine controversy. Carrey began dating actress and former Playboy model Jenny McCarthy in 2005, and the two went public with their relationship the following year, quickly becoming one of the most closely followed celebrity couples in Hollywood for the next several years. McCarthy's young son, Evan, had been diagnosed with autism in 2005, and McCarthy became one of the most visible public figures in the United States, advocating for the discredited theory that childhood vaccines were responsible for rising autism rates, publishing a book on the subject, and appearing regularly on national television to promote her views. Carrey adopted much of McCarthy's public stance during their 5-year relationship, gradually becoming nearly as visible a spokesperson for the cause as McCarthy herself, despite having no medical training of his own. In 2008, he joined her at a march in Washington, D.C., organized under the name Green Hour Vaccines, and in 2009, he published an essay through the Huffington Post arguing against mandatory childhood vaccination schedules and criticizing public health authorities, including the Centers for Disease Control and the American Academy of Pediatrics, writing that the public could not afford to blindly follow the agenda set by vaccine manufacturers and regulators alike. McCarthy, for her part, described Carrey around this time as helping her son connect in ways she said she personally could not, at one point calling him an autism whisperer in an interview, crediting him with genuine patience and curiosity toward Evan rather than treating the relationship as purely performative activism. The scientific research on this question is not ambiguous. Multiple large-scale studies conducted over the following decade, involving hundreds of thousands of children across several countries, found no link between vaccines and autism, and the original 1998 study that first proposed the connection was later retracted by the medical journal that published it after its lead author, Andrew Wakefield, was found to have manipulated the data and lost his medical license as a result. Public health experts at the time, including a director at the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, publicly criticized Carrey's platform for spreading what they described as dangerous misinformation to a massive audience with no medical background to support it, with one commentator writing that Carrey was using his outsized media reach to help rehabilitate the reputation of a doctor whose work history should have already closed the subject. Carrey and McCarthy split in 2010, but Carrey continued voicing skepticism about vaccine mandates for years afterward, including a widely criticized Twitter post in 2015 attacking a new California law requiring childhood vaccinations, in which he described the state's governor as a corporate fascist and accused him of allowing children to be poisoned with mercury and aluminum. He maintained in the same posts that he was not opposed to vaccines broadly, but specifically to a mercury-based preservative once used in some formulations, even though that ingredient had already been removed from the childhood vaccine schedule years earlier in the United States, a fact that undercut much of the argument he was making in real time on social media. The controversy became one of the most persistent stains on Carrey's public reputation, following him well after his relationship with McCarthy had ended and resurfacing in profiles and retrospectives of his career for years afterward. Nothing that followed, however, tested Carrey's public image quite like the events surrounding another relationship, one that ended not in a breakup, but in a death, and eventually a courtroom battle that dragged his private life through years of unwanted headlines. Number 2, the lawsuit over Catriona White. Carrey dated Irish makeup artist Catriona White on and off between 2012 and 2015, even as White married another man, Mark Burton, in Las Vegas in 2013, a detail that made the on-again, off-again nature of her relationship with Carrey even more complicated for those following it from the outside. In September 2015, White was found dead at a home connected to Carrey in the Sherman Oaks area of Los Angeles at the age of 30. Coroner's officials determined that her death was self-inflicted, and reports at the time noted that a note found at the scene had been addressed to Carrey. Carrey attended her funeral in Ireland and released a public statement describing profound grief over losing a woman he said he had deeply loved, writing that she was too sensitive for the harshness of the world around her. The following year, White's estranged husband and her mother, Bridget Sweetman, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Carrey, later represented by attorney Michael Avenatti, a filing that thrust Carrey's private life into headlines for the first time in years. The suit alleged that Carrey had illegally obtained prescription medication under a false name, Arthur King, and provided it to White, directly contributing to her death. An amended version of the complaint went further, alleging that Carrey had also given White a sexually transmitted infection without disclosing it beforehand, and that when she confronted him about it, he responded by manipulating, shaming, and threatening her into staying silent through his representatives. Carrey denied every allegation and filed his own countersuit in 2017, arguing the lawsuits amounted to an attempt to extort him financially by exploiting the death of someone he had loved, stating publicly that he would not tolerate what he called a heartless attempt to profit from her memory. His legal team also presented evidence during the case, suggesting that a document submitted by the opposing side, meant to prove White had a prior sexually transmitted infection unrelated to Carrey, had been forged, a claim that significantly undermined the credibility of that portion of the case. In January 2018, both the original lawsuit and Carrey's countersuit were formally dismissed in Los Angeles Superior Court, with attorneys for both sides declining to comment further on the resolution beyond confirming that the matter had been resolved. A representative for Carrey stated at the time that he was extremely grateful to everyone who had supported him through what was described as a challenging episode, and that he was looking forward to moving on with his life. Attorneys for White's family said separately that Sweetman and Burton were pleased the case had reached a resolution and appreciated the support they said they had received from around the world throughout the proceedings. The case never went to trial, and no findings of fault were ever entered against Carrey by any court. In the years following that legal battle, Carrey's public presence shifted dramatically, moving away from the persona that had made him famous and towards something far more private, philosophical, and, according to Carrey himself, more honest than anything audiences had seen from him before. Number 1. Declaring Jim Carrey doesn't exist. Starting in the mid-2000s, Carrey began stepping back from the kind of high-profile comedic roles that had defined his career for 2 decades. He turned increasingly toward painting and sculpture, producing large volumes of visual art that he described as a more honest form of self-expression than acting had ever allowed him to access, eventually exhibiting his work publicly and publishing a book of his paintings. He began speaking openly in interviews about experiences with depression that had shadowed him for years, even during his most commercially successful periods, telling interviewers that fame had never delivered the lasting sense of relief he had once assumed it would. The clearest articulation of this shift came during the promotional tour for Jim and Andy in 2017, when Carrey told journalists at the Venice Film Festival that the mega-successful entertainer known as Jim Carrey does not actually exist, describing that public figure instead as a character that had been performing him for his entire life, rather than the other way around. He connected this idea directly back to both The Truman Show and his experience losing himself inside Andy Kaufman, describing all three as different angles on the same underlying realization about the gap between a constructed public self and whatever remained underneath it. In a separate red carpet interview around the same period, when asked what designer he was wearing, Carrey gave an answer that startled entertainment reporters, stating that he had stopped pretending his choices carried any deeper meaning and that he no longer wished to participate in projecting an identity that wasn't fully his to begin with, a moment that was widely clipped and shared online as evidence of just how far Carrey had drifted from the persona built by his own biggest films. The reaction to these comments varied widely, with some viewing them as evidence of a genuine and overdue personal transformation, and others treating them as confirmation that one of Hollywood's most manic comedic performers had simply grown exhausted by the character he had spent 30 years building for the benefit of audiences who never got to meet the man underneath it. Carrey himself has never fully resolved which interpretation is correct, returning periodically to mainstream film work, including a long-running role as Dr. Robotnik in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise beginning in 2020, a part that reintroduced him to a new generation of younger viewers who had no context for the philosophical detour his career had taken in the years before it. Even while accepting that kind of mainstream work, he has continued to describe fame itself, in his own words, as an illusion that very nearly cost him his sense of who he actually was, and that took him decades of very public highs and lows to fully see clearly. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.